Hey, Barrick, I heard your, I heard your note about the outdoor rec subcommittee. I'm just interested in general in what the task force is doing. So I'll
And
probably have my camera off and just be listening, but I'm here if anything comes up, um, that you want a reaction to.
wonderful. I appreciate that, Melanie. Thank you.
And Barrick, my mouse pad thingamajigger has been sticking, so I'm not going to put my camera on. I'm going to touch my computer as little as possible so that I don't, when I want to talk, I don't have to mute and unmute and camera and uncamera and all that good stuff. So I'm going to be off camera, but I am here.
Understood. Thank you, ma'am. I think all the gremlins are coming out as it gets to be the end of the year.
I know.
Working for the state government is so glamorous, you know? Only the best of equipment.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I start dating myself, Hillary, but a group of us from Silicon Valley went to DC in 2003 and found that the entire Capitol was still using MS-DOS machines. And we were trying to convince them that maybe it was time to upgrade.
You think my BlackBerry's outdated? No, I'm teasing.
From my cold dead hands, Lieutenant Governor, I hold on to my old BlackBerry.
I love my BlackBerry so much. I would be the first person if they bought it back to get one.
I like my flip phone too. Then I wasn't butt dialing everybody, you know?
Well, I am looking, it is 11:03. It looks like we have Hillary, Elizabeth, Michael, the Lieutenant Governor, and Jennifer, which constitutes a quorum. I am still hopeful that we may see Ms. Beck and Mr. Ortiz, but out of respect for those who have joined, I'm going to move us forward. I will cover our usual administrative items. This is Barrick Abramson with Confluence, supported by my colleague Carrie Steele to facilitate today's conversation. This is the December 18th meeting of the 1296 Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities, the Executive Committee session to discuss the recommendations of the Housing Subcommittee. Claudia, I understand you are solo as an interpreter, so if you need me to take breaks from time to time, do let me know. I appreciate you. With that, our other few administrative items, with the exception of the Lieutenant Governor, whose mouse is acting up, if you are a member of the Executive Committee and are in a place where it is safe and comfortable for you to do so, we would love to have you on camera. Members of the public and members of the subcommittees, we ask you to leave your cameras off until we go to you for comment or questions. And the last request is we ask people to refrain from using the chat, as it can be distracting to the entire conversation, and particularly for those using screen readers or other adaptive technologies. Today's meeting will focus on the housing recommendations. I will be brief but direct in the following. 3 executive committee members, you will get my eternal gratitude, a gold star, and an extra batch of eggnog. I thank you for completing that survey. Other members, I'm going to really lean on you, particularly as we go to the government and the COTO rewrite on January 6th and 7th. We are going to have a lot of issues to get through. And if we don't have members doing those surveys in advance, I'm very concerned we won't get through them. At minimum, that means adding more meetings. In a worst case scenario, that could mean we don't get through all of the recommendations against our deadline to submit your report on January 25th. So I really appreciate you all making time to do that. With that, I'm going to move us right into the conversation. I will tell you, in looking at those who did complete the survey, all but 5 of the recommendations had the support of those completing the survey, and those others, only 1 had an objection, and 4 more had folks saying, I believe the intent is right, but we need to do some substantive work on that. So I'm going to dive us right into these. As I did on our last session together, I'm going to read through the entirety of the recommendation, including the problem they're working to solve, the intended end state, the recommendation itself. Today, we also do have input from several state agencies, particularly from DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, which includes Division of Housing and Division of Local Government. So as we get to each recommendation, I'm going to share what we heard from those agencies because I know I just circulated that to folks late yesterday. So the first idea relates to establishing a working group to examine accessibility of housing documents. By way of background, the Housing Committee was charged and undertook the process of looking at several areas. One was how accessible is the process of finding housing? Things like publications, lease agreements, purchase agreements. We also talked about the inventory of accessible housing itself and how to increase that. And we talked separately about financing. So you'll see recommendations that address each of these. This first one relates to the documents. The problem they identified is that the design, the style, language, and form of different housing-related contracts and publications can create some challenges for individuals with a disability, which can in turn create an even greater barrier to accessible, affordable housing. Their goal is an end state in which all forms, contracts, and publication for housing are designed, published, and made available in ways that maximize accessibility. Recognizing there was a lot of learning to do about that, their recommendation is as follows. Establish a working group to examine practices in place in the private and government sectors relating to the accessibility of housing-related contracts and publications to determine the practicality in different scenarios or documents of plain language use and other practices to improve accessibility and the securing of accessible, affordable housing. They note that the group should incorporate the 2024 definitions for effective communications in Section 504 in their work, and that the group should include property owners, developers, individuals with disabilities, and legal experts, and be convened by the Department of Local Affairs, the Division of Housing, the new CEDU office, or another appropriate state office or agency. State agencies provided the following feedback. Funding would be needed to facilitate this work group. The Division of Housing would recommend landlords representing small, medium, and large properties need to be included in the working group. With that, the three folks who completed the survey said they believe this idea should move forward as is. So I will open it up to the floor if anyone has substantive comments on this, or if we should go straight to a vote on this recommendation.
This is Elizabeth Moran, and I would move that we go straight to a vote.
Thank you, Ms. Moran. I'm seeing thumbs up and nods. So without hearing objection, we will go to a vote on recommendation 1. Mr. Ortiz,
Yes.
Ms. Moran,
Yes?
Ms. Jorgensen,
Yes.
Ms. Harpel,
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Michael Stone, yes.
By a vote of 5-0, the members present and voting members, I will note that the Lieutenant Governor only votes in the event of a tiebreaker. So by unanimous vote, recommendation 1 will move forward. Thank you all. We will go to recommendation 2, which relates to exploring opportunities to provide housing navigators. This group identified that it can be challenging for an individual with a disability to navigate the housing market and their rights under CADA and the ADA in securing affordable, accessible housing. The group sought to create a recommendation to create a state in which every Coloradan with a disability has access to a navigator or system of navigation supports. Their recommendation is as follows. With the goal of creating a system where every Coloradan with a disability has access to a navigator or system of navigation supports, establish partnerships between the Division of Housing, nonprofits, and local entities to provide educational and navigational supports. As a first step, convene all interested parties to develop an assessment and inventory of existing programs and work plan, including potential funding needs at multiple levels of supports and grants. An early step of the work should be identification of a lead partner. The Division of Housing notes that HCPF, the Healthcare Policy and Finance Department, manages similar work currently for Medicaid clients transitioning from institutional settings. The Colorado Disability Funding Committee is statutorily authorized to fund this type of work through nonprofits and counties. With that, I will open it up to comments, any suggestions for changes, or suggestions for a vote. Mr. Ortiz.
I think the one area that they're missing, or maybe because I know this was discussed, but I don't think it's really implied, and I don't like to micromanage too much, but what I don't want to see happen is that it is its own separate navigator, and that, you know, where people are looking for apartments or where people are able to access certain features when it comes to looking for housing, you know, whether that's through Zillow or other online platforms, I want accessible features to be integrated in there. So what do I mean? So like if I need a apartment complex that has ramps for sure, right? That, or if I'm visually impaired, that I can look up these features, that is a choosable feature. I don't want it to be just a separate navigator where I have to, right, where it's separate but not equal. Because my experience, everyone else can speak for themselves, but my experience as someone that has lived with a disability, whenever it's separate, it's never equal.
So Mr. Ortiz, and then I will go to the Lieutenant Governor. Would you propose adding a sentence that any navigational supports should be integrated with existing programs and navigators?
Sure. If we want to word it that way, it's just any accessible features that are going to be featured on a separate navigator must also be viewable, pickable, whatever, however we want to massage that language, into currently existing navigators.
Understood. Thank you. Lieutenant Governor.
Okay, I don't want to be obtuse, but you know, it talks about as a first step, convene all interested parties to develop an assessment and inventory of existing programs and a work plan. Then the part I don't understand is including potential funding needs at multiple levels of supports and grants. Funding needs for what? For programs, for people, for what are we talking about in terms of funding needs? I guess I just need a little clarity.
I appreciate the question. For background context, the conversation related to the housing subcommittee was suggesting that one of the steps would be to identify what the cost and therefore funding needs would be to provide different levels of navigation supports. So if it were going to be all human-based and one-on-one, what would the cost be of that versus what would the cost be of a technology-based or hybrid solution? So what they were looking for was identify what were the range of supports that could be provided and what funding would be needed for each of those levels.
Okay, so it's funding for the navigator work. Okay, got it. Thanks.
And we can certainly include language in the final report that clarifies that.
Okay, for people like me.
I tell you, no, it's not at all. You know, we tried to take what is, you know, we're 100 hours of conversations and distill it down to 5 lines of text. And I think sometimes we lose things in there. So we'll get that in there. If this does go forward, we'll make sure that's clear. Let me go to Hillary and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I just wanted to add a comment and potentially a point of clarification. So when I read the recommendations from the housing subcommittee, the way I understood this recommendation and the next recommendation is that this recommendation was really focused on helping individual people find housing. And the next recommendation was more at like the systemic structural stuff around housing, the technical term stuff. And so I agree with what Ortiz that we should add some kind of language around integration. And from my perspective, I'm coming at this from, you know, the state already pays, like if you're on Medicaid, long-term care services, for like case management. And we shouldn't, and part of that case management is like helping people stay in the community, right? So like we should look at areas where there's potentially like an overlap and not create a separate set of navigators. If there are intersections. So all of that to say that I agree with like the language around integration.
Great. Thank you, Hillary. And I'm just making a note that where possible, look to integrate with other navigation and support programs. I think that's what we've heard from the state. They were pointing to those that HICPUF already manages and whether that would be an appropriate place. To your
Yeah.
first comment, you are absolutely right. This recommendation number 2 spoke to the subcommittee's desire to have direct person-to-person navigation supports, while what we'll get to in the next one is about creating a checklist of accessibility features that exist at that system level. Elizabeth, let me bring you in.
Oh, you know what? I just took my hand down because my question was whether or not, because they specifically bring up the HICPUF similar programming, whether or not the intention from what you gathered from the discussion was to loop that into one navigator system, or whether that would run with it, or kind of what's the intent in the end. What's the intention of what that will look like? What do they anticipate having something that is separate or something that is sort of one global that HICPUF will use?
Yeah, so from the group standpoint, they didn't look at that specific issue. They wanted there to be a navigator, and I think that's their very first sense was what with the goal creating a system where every Coloradan with a disability has access to a navigator. They didn't discuss HICPUF. It was the state's input where they said HICPUF already provides some navigators. Would it make sense to integrate this idea into what HICPUF is doing?
I'll defer to Rep. Ortiz, but I do have a follow-up.
Rep. Ortiz, and then back to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for clarity's sake, I just want to point out that, you know, in the original long report that you guys amazingly put together and put forward to us, it clearly states like the problem they're trying to solve and then what the intended end state is. So if there's questions about what the intended end state is, it kind of states it real clearly right there.
Yeah, and I'll just read that. Every Coloradan with a disability has access to a navigator or system of navigation supports. Elizabeth, did you want to follow up?
It's just to make a comment in light of some of the challenges we have heard with HICPUF and some of the systems, particularly their online systems, their tech platforms. I think that they should be at the table. I have concerns about implementation, but I also and I don't know that we can make a change in here that would word it, but I would love to see something in here that makes the goal one system, one navigator, because I know at least for my network, often we hear about well, which one did you use, or which one are you talking about, or which one is the right one, or right? And boy, if we could minimize that and say, you know what, this is a system that we can all get on board with, whether you are a state agency or someone who administers Medicaid or other programs or not. This is a system that we can all use.
I appreciate that, and I'll just throw out, and then I'll bring in Rep. Ortiz. We could combine these and offer a sentence in here, keep the recommendation as is, but say where possible, look to integrate with other navigation programs to provide a single point of support while also ensuring the quality of support delivered, to get to your point. But let me bring in Rep. Ortiz, and then I'll come back to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, because I think two different things are being discussed, whether we're talking about formalized case management into housing through HICPUF and other institutions like that, versus like those of us that live with a disability that aren't necessarily looking for that are using Zillow or using whatever navigators that currently exist to try and find accessible apartment or housing for what we might need with currently existing navigators. Those are two separate issues. Like the idea that we try and mandate just one, because I was there for some of those meetings, both of those issues were discussed. So like, I think as far as like, well, wherever case management is concerned, that there be one navigator, sure, I think that's very helpful. And then creating a system where they set up what the standards are for that. But I don't want to miss out on also making sure that we create a clear mandate that navigators that exist out there, I don't want to just be able to look up, well, I want a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 bathrooms. No, I want a 1-bedroom apartment with an accessible bathroom and that has an accessible laundry room, right? Like I want to make sure that the private sector is thinking of us and including us when it comes to making sure that we're getting our needs met for accessible, affordable housing.
I'm going to go to Hillary next. As I'm listening to everyone, what we could do is say where possible, look to integrate with other navigation programs for those accessing them, while also allowing individuals to directly access these navigation supports. So to the points I'm hearing, for those who may be using those Medicaid or other program supports through HCPF, this is available through that one point of contact, but we're not forcing everyone to. Hillary, let me bring you in.
Yeah, actually, great minds think alike, Eric. I think the part of the discussion we're having is actually the definition of navigator. Like, I read the word navigator and I automatically assumed it was a person, right? Whereas I think what the keys was like thinking about, like things that are not people. And so, Eric, I think what you proposed looks, because there are also entities, I mean, I specifically mentioned Medicaid, but like the Centers for Independent Living, for example, use this kind of navigation regardless of income, right? And so, sorry, I was about to say like what you proposed. Whether it's a person or tool or app or website or whatever.
Okay, so let me offer some language, and I will say what I will propose is to see if we want to take a vote on this with clarity that we can always add framing language into the report to get even more clear on what we want. But what we can do is keep the recommendation as is and add a statement that where possible, look to integrate with other navigation programs for those accessing those existing programs, while also allowing those who only need these housing navigation supports to access them directly. With that, I see some thumbs up. Should we go to a vote on this one? Okay. I'm going to go to a vote, and then Claudia, I'm going to give a 2-minute break because I know you're operating solo. So I'll give you a break after this vote if you'd like.
Before you count the vote, can you exactly rephrase one more time the language that you're looking to put into, please?
I appreciate the break. I want to let you know a second interpreter has been confirmed. We need to make sure that you let them into the meeting as soon as they log in. The person's name is Anna.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claudia. Representative
Yes.
Ortiz, did you want me to read the full recommendation or just the sentence that would be added?
No, just the changes that we're making, please.
So the only change would be the addition of the following language. Where possible, look to integrate these supports with other existing navigation programs for those accessing those programs, while also allowing individuals who only need these housing navigation supports to access them directly.
And does that achieve what we're trying to get at? Because I feel like we're talking two different things here. And again, the housing subcommittee, for those that attended, we're kind of attacking this from two different angles. One, existing navigating systems. And so like when someone's like, well, I thought they meant the definition of navigating, meaning this. Like, again, if you read what Barrick and Carrie had put together, it kind of outlines exactly what problem they're trying to solve, what the intended end state, and then the recommendation. So if you take all those three, it makes it very clear that we are trying to integrate, not just integrate, we're trying to make sure that when navigation systems or apps or whatever that are used to find housing are being created, that there's also choosable options around accessible options, which is currently not being done. And to also incorporate what Elizabeth was bringing up, like if we're talking about the HCPF navigator, which I think is more what Hillary and Elizabeth were talking about, that is also accessible and that is standardized and that there's one-stop shop that people can stop for that. I just want to make sure that we're not losing both pieces in the changes that we're making and that we are accomplishing both goals in what, and if Hillary and Elizabeth would also chime in and lend their voice and say, do you think this change makes sure that we're doing both and not losing one or the other, or not focusing too much on one or the other?
Understood. And well, thank you, Representative Ortiz, and welcome Hillary or others to lean in. I will clarify that our next recommendation will speak to the checklist of accessibility features. So right now, what we're talking about is the actual proactive navigation supports or navigator that someone could access, and adding this language to be clear that we're not trying to create a new navigation system that forces those that may already use HCPUF's program to go to yet another place. This would be intended to integrate with that for those accessing those HCPUF navigators, or for those not accessing them, they would come to this directly. Hillary, do you want to weigh in on the representative's question?
Yes, and I'm just gonna caveat that I'm about to say that I was not at every housing subcommittee. I was only able to do a couple. So, I would 100% defer to people who were there. I think based on the materials that Eric and Kelly prepared, I interpreted it as this recommendation was getting at the people, and the next recommendation was getting at like the tech. However, I think we need both. And so I am totally in favor of like if we want on this recommendation to clearly state like it needs to be people and non-people. I don't know that the term is, but like websites, apps, advertisements, things like that. I'm totally fine with that. I just took the materials you had prepared and put my own lens onto them and got a different interpretation. But I do believe we need both, and I'm totally in favor of making sure we clearly state that, however we want to do that.
And if that's the desire of the committee, we can certainly add a statement that it is the intention of the subcommittee that recommendation 2 and recommendation 3 be considered critical components and complements to one another. Elizabeth, Elizabeth, do you have a comment?
No, nothing that hasn't already been said, but I certainly agree with Hillary and supporting the folks who were perhaps there and more engaged in those individual discussions. I'm mindful about Lieutenant Governor made a comment that not everyone is on Medicaid that needs help, and I think it's a valid point. I think what I'm trying to get at is I'd like to see some level of commitment to consistency between those two systems. And certainly we can't dictate what the state agency does necessarily through this anyway, but I would just like there to be consistency. If it's not a one navigator system, whether that is a person or a thing or whatever that looks like, if it is not a one stop, people have to wonder where they go, right? Or what is this system, or what's the difference? I don't want to create more questions. The more we talk about this, the more I'm having a little angst about creating, making things more complicated in an effort to make things less complicated, right? With the thinking of, I just want consistency. If we have to have two different systems, like one that certainly the state agency, the administrative agency uses versus anyone else can use, right? Anyone who desires to interface with a navigator or a navigation system, I want there to be consistency between those systems as far as how they function and what the interface experience is, to the extent that that is reasonably possible. I'm not being terribly articulate, but I hope you're getting the gist of what the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm going, so.
Yeah, understood. And here's
but
where
initially
I am
I am in favor of this. I support this idea and I support doing this. I'll pause.
Understood. Let me offer some language, and I will be transparent. The balance I want to strike is I don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I also don't want to shortcut this conversation after 15 months of hard work. What I would suggest is that we could add the following language addressing this conversation. It is the intent of the executive committee that both recommendations 2 and 3 are critical and complementary recommendations that should be advanced together. The executive committee also believes it is critical to the successful implementation of the navigation system that all navigation supports operate consistently, work collaboratively, and avoid unnecessary duplication or confusion.
That sounds, yeah, I see Hillary nodding her head. I know I'm not on camera, I'm nodding my head. That sounds good to me
Okay.
too.
All right. With that, then, if I don't see objection or hear objection, I'm going to go to a roll call vote. Mr. Ortiz,
Yes.
Elizabeth,
Yes. Yes.
Hillary,
Yes.
Jennifer,
Yes.
Michael.
Michael Stone, yes.
Thank you. By unanimous vote, recommendation 2 passes with the revisions to clarify this is intended to work collaboratively and consistently with other programs, that it is essential that this be integrated with recommendation 3 that we will go to next, and that it avoid unnecessary duplication or confusion. We will also follow up with all of you with final language. With that, I will move us to recommendation 3, which relates to supporting the creation and use of a checklist of housing accessible features. By way of background, the problem identified in the shortest terms was that there is often limited information about the specific accessibility features or limitations of properties available for lease. And the subcommittee sought to create a new end state in which consistent, easy to access information about the features and limitations of for lease housing are available. I will share with all of you, this was an extended conversation that related to how do we make sure that advertisements and other information disclose what the limitations or the accessibility are. Some folks started with the idea of let's require publishing A, B, and C. As they got stakeholder feedback during October, they revised it to be the following. Through a collaboration of housing experts and the disability community, create a checklist of accessibility features available in properties for lease, and to explore the most feasible ways to roll out this checklist. Further, task the group with developing standards for inclusion of information about the number, type, and specific features of units in multi-unit buildings where a single individual or entity owns 4 or more units. The stated goal in creating such collaboration should be to reach a rental housing market in which all online or printed for rent listings of property in a building with 4 or more units include the information in the checklist created and details about the number of units with accessibility features, including the details of those features. Owners of properties with fewer than 4 units should also be invited and encouraged to provide the same information. We received the following feedback from the state. Funding is needed to facilitate the development of a checklist for accessibility features that property owners could use to evaluate their properties for access features beneficial to people with various types of disabilities. Representative Ortiz.
Yeah, first I'm going to quash the feedback about funding is necessary. Was there state funding necessary for apartment complexes to make searchable and choosable the fact that they have a 2-bedroom apartment available or a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment available? That's ridiculous to say that, oh, well, we need funding to make sure that we can make it choosable, that we state that there's a ramp, or that we state that there's an accessible laundry room, or we state that so I'm going to push back on that one, and I'm going to reject that entirely, that we say that there's funding necessary for private entities that make these so that they can create a checklist. This is work that they should have been doing. They're required by ADA to and by the formula to make a certain amount of the units accessible anyways. I'm going to push back on that. So, but I just want to make sure that somewhere in there that it's very clear that if these apartment complexes or there's entities out there that create searchable options for any type of feature, whether it is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment or a 1-bedroom, 1-bath apartment, that they also must include accessible features as something that is searchable and clickable.
Understood. And we could certainly add a statement back in, and I say back in because as Rep. Ortiz probably remembers, during the Housing Subcommittee's conversations, there was at one point a statement to say require all publications and advertisements that list any features of a unit to also list the accessibility features or limitations. They ended up modifying that to say, let's create this checklist. It's certainly in your purview as the executive committee to add back in that requirement by simply stating, require the use of this checklist in any advertisement in which the property owner lists any features about the property. Hillary, and then Rep. Ortiz.
I would be fine putting the word require back in. And then I imagine the feedback from the entities that manage private housing, and they me not to have a requirement, and I'm fine. I wonder if we could clarify. So the way that I read that recommendation, I assumed the funding was for the working group and not for the private entities trying to get compliance. If that is actually the case, maybe we could clarify the funding is for the working group and not the private entities.
And to be clear, in the recommendation, there is no addressing funding. As I read DOLA's comment, they're saying funding would be needed to facilitate the development of a checklist. What the recommendation was to convene a group to develop the checklist. I don't want to speak for DOLA, but I read it to mean DOLA saying we would need funding to convene these stakeholders to develop the checklist.
Got it, thank you, and thank you for that clarification. I have a lot of stuff in front of me, so.
All good, that's why I'm here to read it. Rep. Ortiz.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Hillary in that, like, if there is, because that's the way I read it too, is like, I didn't read it like necessarily it's like specifying a work group like we specified this task force, but if there's going to be a group put together to decide what this checklist looks like, sure. I just want to be very clear that them including accessible options in what they already have for their features when it comes to searchable complexes or housing options or opportunities, that we're not waiting on this work group. Like that is, you know, it's the same thing that I did with the car rental companies and or the peer-to-peer car rental companies. And if anybody doesn't know what the peer-to-peer rental car company is, they're like the Airbnb, but for cars, right? And that is something that I didn't allocate any state funding for them to do because this is something they should be doing anyways, right? So just to give some context there and kind of where I'm coming from when it comes to this.
Understood. And I think I will obviously leave it to this group. The recommendation is for there to be this collaboration among these stakeholders to create this checklist. The recommendation itself did not specify who should convene that and whether it should be funded. It simply said that through this collaboration, a group should be tasked with developing this checklist. You all have suggested that we reinsert the language to require the use of the checklist by any property owner who lists any features about their property. You are free to suggest that there be funding for a group. You are free to not address funding. You are free to include a direction of who should convene this group. Where it landed was simply that a group should create this checklist. Rep. Ortiz. Rep. Ortiz, I've got your hand up, but you're still on mute. Did you want to address the group?
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, apologies. So I guess I would recommend the following language, and the work group can change it or massage it however they want to. But I want to make it very clear that if any entity, private or public, whether through an app or a website or whatever, allows individuals with or without a disability to choose features such as 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, whatever, choose specific features to filter out and search housing options, that they also must be required to include features around basic access and accessibility. Going off of that, so like that's step one, because that's the problem that we're trying to solve here, is that people can try and link themselves up with accessible housing options. That we support the idea, or we support the idea of a work group coming together to standardize and or facilitate a list of accessible features, but that the requirement to do so not be dependent on that work group being organized and or funded.
Understood. So I think this is a conversation for this executive committee to have. For background, this is where the subcommittee started, was with their idea that they shared to require that any advertisement for a property that lists any features also require the listing of accessibility features or limitations. As they developed their final recommendations, they walked that back a step to instead say, create a checklist of the accessibility features and then require its use. Rep. Ortiz is suggesting we not hold off on that checklist and instead require the property owners to list those, if I'm hearing you correctly, Rep. Ortiz.
I'm a little confused about, because I must have missed that day where because like you keep using the word advertisement, right? And like when I think of advertisement, I think of commercials, I think of pop-ups, I think of whatever, right? Like there's a lot of different ways to advertise. I know that this discussion started around and was based around the fact that there already exists for able-bodied folks a way to search options that work for them. But that in those filters, whether we're talking about Zillow or whether we're talking about individual apartment complexes on their website that allow you to select certain features. And again, I don't consider that advertisement. I consider that a tool to be able to connect you with the best housing option available. That already exists for able-bodied folks, but not for disabled folks. And so I feel like that discussion was already anchored around making sure that we are thought of and that we can search using those apps that currently exist or using those websites that currently exist, accessible features in apartment complexes. I know that it eventually molded, because it always does when business is concerned, well, how do we make it as efficient and cost effective for us? And if we can get money on top of that, how do we do that? Because that's what some of this smells like to me. Just being very honest and frank about it. I think we should be very clear about what the requirement or end state is. And that is that if there is any type of search engine or app used to search housing features, whether that's, again, I go back to 2-bedroom, 1-bath, or search amenities like, oh, you have laundry units in the unit, or there's common area laundry units, that they also must include basic accessible features that are searchable and clickable. Now, so I want that to be the mandate. I don't want to micromanage. Now, we as an executive committee can make the recommendation that if DOLA and others want to create a working group that makes it easier for businesses to create a list of those accessible features, sure, we recommend that as well. But that the requirement cannot be dependent on funding and supporting a work group like that.
Understood. So let me offer, and then I'll bring Hillary in. I don't think you and I are describing differently what is being recommended as the end state. There is a difference in what the subcommittee recommended be the process to get there and what you are proposing, and I think we should discuss that. But they were specific that we're talking about all online or printed for rent listings be required in the recommendation to include all of the information in this checklist if the online listing or printed listing provides any information of any features, such as you suggested around the number of bedrooms or laundry. I think that, so we're speaking to the same types of listing and information, with the difference being the group put forward the recommendation to form a working group that would develop this checklist. And when developed, the checklist would become required. I'm hearing you say we shouldn't wait on the checklist. We should require these property owners to list this information or include it. And if one path to getting or supporting that is a working group, we can include that. So I think we're talking about same outcome, different paths to it. Let me bring in Hillary and then the Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah, so I 100% agree with the final thing. Like, it should be searchable, people should be able to find the information they need about accessibility. I keep coming back to the question of how information is going to be uniformly searchable if there's no list. Because I think if there's no list, that's gonna happen, like standardized list is you're gonna get some entities that are gonna list, literally hundreds of features, and you're gonna get some that are gonna list few, because access needs across disability type are just really, really different. And so I kind of feel like just logistically, the standardized list has to come first. I'm agnostic about whether the list comes from a looking group or like not a looking group, but what I'm not agnostic about is I think the standardized list absolutely needs to have input from people with disabilities about what should be on the list. But I'm agnostic about whether that's a looking group or whether it just does it with input.
Understood. Thank you. And I'm going to go to the Lieutenant Governor next and then Rep Ortiz. Hillary, I will just share what you are stating is consistent with what I heard from the members, which is why they actually didn't describe a working group. And what they said was through a collaboration of housing experts and the disability community, create this checklist of accessibility features. And I will tell you the conversation paralleled what you just offered. People were concerned that if we don't have a list that these property owners have to check yes or no by each, you would have that inconsistent information. Let me go to the Lieutenant Governor and then to Rep Ortiz.
So I think the value of a work group would be to include people with all types of disabilities, because what might be accessible for someone with a physical disability might be different from somebody. I don't know, Shannon's on the call today too, but are there features that would be helpful for a person who is deaf to know, the features that would be helpful for someone that has COPD or asthma to know, those kinds of things. So I'm kind of like Rep Ortiz. I kind of like the requiring part, but I just didn't know if the checklist that they're referring to is all inclusive of all disabilities.
My understanding, Lieutenant Governor, is that is their intention, which is why they wanted it to be created by people with disabilities to inform it. But I look to all of you for guidance on this. Rep Ortiz?
Yep. So
I'm glad to see that big old clunky thing.
Yep. So just want to kind of riff off of what Hillary and the Lieutenant Governor were saying. I understand that it would make everyone feel the warm and fuzzy to put this work group or whatever they want to identify it to create this list. Here's the thing. I want to make a couple points. One, there's already a list out there that exists for how they meet current accessibility requirements when it comes to the equation to meet current existing law, right? Like there are counties that should have that in order to say that they're currently, and we all know that that current equation is not enough, that is not creating enough accessible options, right? But there are already standards on what is accessible and not that exist out there. It might not be accessible to everyone. It might not be in a one-stop shop. It might not be digestible to everyone, which is part of the reason why we have all these problems. My concern in saying that we put the requirement of the list first, and I think Hillary understands this too, is that then they're just not going to keep doing it. They're just not going to do it until this list gets done. And then it gives them an excuse not to do it because they're going to be like, well, we don't want to pay for it. We shouldn't have to pay for it. This is another mandate or requirement that you're putting on it. So I would like to put the recommendation out there that we say within 10 years, however you want to get there, no later than 10 years, but it can be sooner, that any entity that uses whether you call it an advertisement like you do, Barrett, but any way of listings that they must include accessible features. The executive committee also supports the creation of any type of work group or entity or organization or amalgamation of organizations that must include people with disabilities, that would create a checklist to make it easier for these entities to understand what that is. But I feel like people that have been in this fight for a while should understand what my concerns are here. That if we say, oh, well, we can't do that until we create a list, then that list is going to be used as an excuse to not do anything. And especially funding a work group to put this list together is going to be definitely used as an excuse. And like, we see how tight of a budget we're in already. Like the Gov's budget includes some deep cuts to Medicare, Medicaid. I just don't think that in that type of financial environment that they're going to be electeds and or advocates out there that are going to be like, yeah, let's definitely divert funding to make sure that we put this work group together to create this list. I think we should offer those as options, but that we create a floor of a timeline and the requirement no matter what, as a looming horizon, that this is going to happen no matter what, however you all decide to get there, however you all decide to fund it. That is, we're not going to micromanage that. That is up to you. But this is going to be a requirement within, and then you let the courts decide after that.
Understood. And Rep. Ortiz, I don't think that what you're suggesting is at all at odds with what the subcommittee discussed. I would offer that we could add a sentence very similar to what you're saying to the start of this, that says within 10 years, every listing of properties for rent that lists any features must include a comprehensive list of the accessibility features and limitations. As a path to support this, explore and then pick up with the recommendation of collaboration of housing experts in the disability community to create a checklist. So add your language to the start of it to say within 10 years, every listing must, and then offer that as a path to it. Could get at what you're addressing. Again, anything I offer is not me advocating for or against. It's trying to reflect what I'm hearing. Hillary, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I am extremely sympathetic to what the teasers, point. But I think that you're suggesting in terms of proposed language could look. But I also want to put on record that my concern around the current list that exists is it is not fully inclusive. It's basically all about physical accessibility for people with mobility impairments. Like it doesn't include like visual fire alarms or people who are deaf, or hard of hearing who might not be able to hear the fire alarm, etc. And so I think if we rely on that list, we're gonna be leaving out a lot of features for people who have a disability that is not mobility related. And so that's kind of why, I was thinking about like the need for a list first. Again, I am totally sympathetic to what Ortiz is saying. I just worry that if we rely on the current list, it's basically going to be a tool that only works for people with who need physical mobility, feature. Who need features because of a physical mobility disability.
Eric, you're on mute.
Yep.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Hillary, what you're saying is entirely consistent with the group's discussion. I think we could say that within 10 years, every listing of properties for rent that lists any features must include a comprehensive list of the accessibility features and limitations, including without limitation, those affecting mobility, visual, hearing, IDD, or other disabilities. As a path to support this, explore and go into the collaboration to develop the checklist.
I like that.
Great. Lieutenant Governor.
So Hillary's point was my point exactly. And my question is there already a list, Rep. Ortiz, that apartment people could use. I know there's lists for required development. And I think the state funds a not so great site with some features, but I just want to make sure it's all inclusive. So could we ask them to require them to use the current list, and the task force would tweak the list to make it all inclusive of all disabilities?
Lieutenant Governor, I'm not going to offer my opinion. I will only share that the group did hear from several people in housing and in the disability community who felt that the lists that exist are wholly inadequate, which is why they suggested gathering people with a disability, the disability community and housing experts to develop a comprehensive list.
So we could do that and make it more time sensitive, rather than the 10 years that I think Rep. Ortiz just used as an example. We could give them a time frame of maybe in a year or two, they develop this list, and then the landlords are required to use it after that.
Mr. Stone and then Mr. Ortiz.
Thank you. Michael Stone speaking. Very much in support of what the Lieutenant Governor just suggested with respect to the time frame. I got a very uncomfortable feeling when we're talking about 10 years. There's no reason why this needs to be extended that far off.
So let me offer a thought, and then I'll bring in Rep. Ortiz. We had just talked about adding a sentence that says within X years, in this case 10, require every listing to include this information. And then we went on to say, as a path to this, explore this collaboration. We could reverse that and say, within 2 years, convene a group to develop this checklist. And we could conclude it by saying, if no such group has been convened within 2 years, require every listing to include this comprehensive list of accessibility features. So we're essentially giving the opportunity for the state to create this group, but a fail-safe that if that doesn't happen within 2 years, we would then require the property owners to then. And I'm putting 2 years as a hypothetical. Rep. Ortiz, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything from what Hillary said to your first revision, to what the Lieutenant Governor said, to what Mr. Stone has said. Like, this is, and like 10 is just a number I threw out there, just like you said, it was just a placeholder. So if we want to change the timeline on both, I'm game for that. And I think that would be very helpful, because then ultimately we're getting at the point of, you're going to list these no matter what. You're going to list these no matter what. We should get this, whatever entity to create a comprehensive list within X amount of years. But if you don't do that, you're still going to require to list what exists. And I just also want to, I know it's not good enough. I'm not trying to say, well, yeah, we definitely include features that aren't just for people with mobility issues, because the flashing lights with the fire alarms, that's not for me. Like that, there are certain current requirements on the equation that exist that are not just about people with mobility issues. That being said, like, it is wholly inadequate and it is not enough, which is why I also like this discussion on creating a timeline around this list and not guaranteeing funding for it either. Like, this is about safety. This is about liability. And if you create that impression that it's about safety and liability, then you'll get change. Look what has happened in the airline industry just recently around American Airlines getting hit with a $50 million fine. And now the newest announcement coming from the Department of Transportation that they're creating new guidelines now around dignified and safe access for people with disabilities. You know why that happened? Because their bottom line was hit, because there was liability that was placed clearly on them. There wasn't some work group that was funded by the national government that was put together to create this list that got them where they're at. And so, like, I want to encourage that as a member of the executive committee, but I don't want to have the progress dependent and waiting on that.
Understood. Let me do this. Because we are 1 hour into a 2-hour meeting and we are currently on recommendation 3, I'm going to suggest some language. We can decide to vote on this, or we can decide to table this and come back to it. I want to make sure we get through some others. But hearing everything, what I'm going to offer is that we keep the original language, discussing through a collaboration of housing experts and the disability community, create a checklist, but we conclude the recommendation with the following. If within 2 years, no such group has been convened, or adopted a checklist, require every listing of properties for rent that list any features to include a comprehensive list of the accessibility features and limitations, including those affecting mobility, visual, hearing, IDD, or other disabilities.
I like it.
I'm seeing some thumbs up and some nods. I'm going to go to a vote on this one. I don't want anyone to feel pressured. If you're not comfortable, we can come back to this, but we will move this to a vote, starting with Mr. Ortiz.
Yes.
Ms. Moran,
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen,
Yes.
Ms. Hartful.
So what happened? Is there the ability to abstain from voting? Sorry to take us down a
is
procedural
absolutely
path.
Yes, that is an option.
Okay. Is that going to be a problem? Do we not have enough people to move it forward without me?
That is not a problem. And it is absolutely you're right. And I don't want you to ever weigh what others are doing in your vote.
Okay, I'm going to abstain on this one. Thank
Ms.
you.
Hartful abstains. Mr. Stone.
Michael Stone, yes.
By a vote of 4 yes, 1 abstention, the recommendation passes. The recommendation, to be clear, is as written with the addition of setting a 2-year sunset on this, that if no group has been convened or adopted this checklist, the requirement would go into place. With that, I will move us to recommendation 4. This is around creating a guide to encourage efforts to expand the inventory of affordable, accessible housing for individuals with a disability. The group discussed the problem that Colorado has a highly competitive housing market with shortages in nearly every location and price point. There are limited uses of local processes that are targeted to expand the inventory of affordable, accessible housing. The group wanted to create an end state where local governments are aware of and regularly consider a wide range of tools and incentives they can consider to encourage the development of affordable, accessible housing. For those of you who didn't have the opportunity to follow the housing subcommittee, there was a lot of discussion of what authority in Colorado's local control context the state could have to require local governments to act in certain ways to expand the inventory or to include accessible housing as one of their guide marks or weighted factors. They landed on the following: provide resources to and direct the Division of Housing in partnership with the Division of Local Government and organizations representing local governments, developers, and the disability community to develop a guide for local governments with topics to consider in land use, building permits, and development approvals relating to expanding the inventory of affordable, accessible housing for individuals with a disability. Encourage the Division of Housing and Division of Local Government to incorporate this guide and information into their existing and future efforts. DOLA provided the following: the Division of Housing and Division of Local Government provide a variety of information and guidance to local governments and housing developers. Creating and maintaining additional guidance on developing accessible housing would require additional resources. Would anyone like to weigh in favor, in concern, opposition, or ideas relating to recommendation 4? Seeing none, I will go to a vote and we will see where we are. On the recommendation to provide the resources to and direct DOH in partnership with DLG to develop a guide for local governments with topics to consider in their land use, building permits, and development approvals relating to expanding the inventory of affordable, accessible housing for individuals with a disability. I'll switch up the order just to mix it up a bit. Michael Stone.
Michael Stone, yes.
Jennifer.
Yes.
Hillary.
Yes.
Elizabeth.
Yes.
Representative Ortiz.
Yes.
By unanimous vote, that recommendation moves forward. I appreciate everyone moving quickly through that one. I hope it was because you so loved the thoughtfulness that went into that idea. I will move us next to recommendation 5. And I want to be clear, we talked earlier about navigators for individuals with a disability seeking housing. We've got a different idea involving navigators here, and the idea is to establish accessibility navigators for property owners. The group identified that not every property owner is fully informed of accessibility requirements, and the information about these requirements and best practices can be difficult or time-consuming to find. I will add an editorial note here. The group was particularly concerned about small businesses or individuals that may own 1 or 2 properties here. They want to create an end state where there are easy to access systems or individuals who can provide information to property owners about accessibility requirements and opportunities to go above minimum requirements. So their recommendation is as follows. Establish within an appropriate division of state government an accessibility navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing. They offer this implementation note that we may want to look at Excel's design assistance programs, CHAPA's technical assistance program, and parallel federal programs in developing this. DOLA provided the following, and then Hillary, I'll go to you first. DOLA said that DOH and DLG provide a variety of information and guidance to local government and housing developers. Providing technical support on developing accessible housing would require additional resources. Hillary.
I am really supportive of this, and I actually think it's maybe one of the potentially most impactful recommendations of this subcommittee. I know that it takes resources, but I think I have heard frequently from the community of home builders that they want to do the right thing, architects want to do the right thing, they just don't know where to turn for guidance. And so I think it makes complete sense to have the elements, to provide this kind of resource that has the elements that code enforcement too on the front end to make sure we're building things accessibly instead of having to sue on the back end. So just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Hillary. Any other thoughts in support, questions of clarification, or concerns about this recommendation?
Mr. Stone has his hand up.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Michael Stone speaking. So this is I very much agree with Hillary. This has been a challenge from day one, and I agree that how impactful this was. One of my challenges is always comes back to municipalities and local, because when developers, of which I'm a longtime developer myself, goes, we pretty much keep things very local, and so whether or not it's the planning divisions, the permitting, and so forth, most of this information should already be there. But let's just go with the fact that it might be a little bit more difficult. I just keep wanting to tighten this up a little bit, because I could see where the pitfalls are with this. And while the language is great, and this was a I followed this very closely with the housing subcommittee. This is a challenging one, and not a simple answer. So the question I have, and really for a quick, hopefully quick discussion, would be how do we move that to more local government?
And Mr. Stone, I'm going to respond with a question for you about how we may want to approach this, given the limits of the state to require local governments to do things. We can certainly say here we're going to create this position within state government. We could go anywhere along the spectrum from encourage local governments and provide technical assistance and supports to them to do the same. You could get bold and disruptive and say require local governments. I think we would do so understanding the challenges that might present, but that's not me advocating for or against. So I think we can go anywhere to your idea of providing technical assistance to local governments to provide the same supports, or you could go so far as to require local governments.
Michael Stone again. I mean, personally, I would love to make that local requirement. I would really like to open it up to the group to hear their thoughts on it. Just because that to me solves an enormous problem and also addresses the inherent flaw with sort of the pushback that we're getting. I think we can do both. I think the state needs to reply to provide that as a mandate. That's me speaking though.
I'm going to bring in Representative Ortiz. I will also just offer for the group, this starts intersecting with a lot of the discussions that the government subcommittee had about what are the challenges that may exist when you require all local governments, regardless of their size, to provide different services. Local government, as you've probably seen in the report, ended up landing on recommendations that scale that say, if you're a government of this size, do this, or as it allows, or FTE count. Again, not me advocating, just saying we are going to have to, as an exec committee, if we're making a recommendation that would require local governments to do something, figure out how you want to address what will be the pushback of, we're a town of 17, we don't have someone to do that. I make no opinion and invite ideas on how we address this. Rep. Ortiz.
Yep. So I agree with Mr. Stone. I agree with Hillary. Like, I think this is a very critical piece. I don't want to lose it by creating additional requirements. So what I would ask or recommend or ask the executive committee to consider is maybe we present this as its own recommendation and then just copy and paste it, but then do a local government recommendation. And that way we address Mr. Stone's ask and his perspective and opinion that that is supported by some here, without necessarily losing and influencing or impacting negatively or positively this one. But that's my 2 cents. I want to know what the rest of the committee thinks.
If we went down that path, and we'll open it to the committee, we could add the statement that the state should provide technical assistance to local governments to provide the same services if possible. Then we could copy and paste this and say require local governments to establish a position that does, and exactly as Rep. Ortiz offered, would be ways we could approach what I'm hearing from the group. Hillary?
Yeah, I like that approach. Because I think it gets at some of the nuance around, special districts, look at government too, and some of them are very small. So yes, I like that suggestion. And agree with Mr. Stone and what Ortiz. And it gets around some of the difficulty in the local control kind of concerns.
Then what I will offer is the following. We would have recommendation 5 would be established within an appropriate division of state government an accessibility navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing. Added sentence, the state should provide technical assistance to local governments to provide the same services. Stop. Recommendation 5B, newly created by the executive committee, require local governments to establish an accessibility navigator or position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing.
Love it.
Okay. Then we will first go to a vote on recommendation 5, which is the original recommendation with the addition of the sentence reading, the state should provide technical assistance to local governments to provide the same services. We will then go to a separate roll call vote on 5B. On recommendation 5, Mr. Ortiz.
Yes.
Ms. Moran.
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen.
Yes.
Ms. Harpole.
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
By unanimous vote of the members present, recommendation 5 passes. Recommendation 5B, New recommendation not offered by the subcommittee, developed by the executive committee, would require local governments to establish an accessibility navigator position or office. We'll mix it up and start in reverse order. Mr. Stone,
Yes.
Ms. Harpole,
Abstain.
Ms. Jorgensen,
Yes.
Ms. Moran,
Yes.
Representative Ortiz.
Yes.
By a vote of 4 in favor and 1 abstention, recommendation now 5B will move forward. Recommendation 6 gets a little meaty. Full transparency. This is the combination of, I think, 4 or 5 ideas. So the group identity, the summary is to undertake a comprehensive approach to data collection and analysis about the inventory and need for affordable, accessible housing. By way of background, when this subcommittee started a year ago, one of the conversations was, what do we know about the inventory and the need for accessible housing? And frankly, the data was limited and unclear. They wanted to know what type of accessible housing was needed. Some of the things that you all have identified, it wasn't just about those with a mobility disability. So they wanted to know what the needs were and where those needs were across Colorado. As they looked for data in either the census data or other surveys, they found it was inconsistent and not comprehensive, and spent a lot of time trying to develop how do we understand, get a full picture. They said that there are significant limitations on the timeliness, the breadth, and specificity of data relating to the current inventory of and the current or future needs for different types of affordable, accessible housing. Where data is available, it is often not disaggregated by specific type of accessibility feature or needs, type of housing, or the detailed location more specific than a zip code or county. They want to create a world where Colorado has a comprehensive, easy to access, analyze, and maintain as current data about this inventory and the needs for affordable, accessible housing. So their combination, and I'm going to take a quick drink because this is 5 different points. It's only water. To establish a clear assessment of available, accessible housing and to inform future legislation, regulation, or state programs, the state should undertake a multifaceted approach to expand the collection, availability, and use of data relating to accessible housing. This effort should include all of the following. Number 1, instruct the appropriate agency with relevant expertise to collaborate with CEDU, DOLA, or others as appropriate to maximize the current and future collection of data to support the greatest available information about the inventory of accessible and adaptable housing, which includes features relating to other services, including those for the IDD community, as well as the aging caretakers community. Number 2, in developing the system, data schema, and collection of data, sync with and build on the data gathered by the U.S. Census Bureau and the American Community Survey, identifying the percent of households with disabilities broken out by the number of units in the structure, the year the structure was built, the type of disability, and the county. Number 3, establish a statewide process and requirement for an accessibility report to be completed by a property owner or their agent on all properties of 4 or more units when they are bought, sold, or refinanced to confirm compliance with federal and state disability laws. Number 5, publish the data referenced above and maximize awareness of it among housing authorities, government bodies, developers, and organizations supporting individuals with disabilities. They offered the implementation note that in advancing these efforts, attention and consideration should be given to minimize any requirements that could have the effect of reducing new inventory or that establish undue burden for developers. Our state colleagues at DOLA offered the following: creating a database of accessible housing inventory statewide and maintaining the database to keep it current would require both initial and ongoing financial support. It's a meaty recommendation. If there's any pieces you would like me to read back, I'm happy to. I'd also like to invite members to weigh in with questions, points of clarification, or concerns. Mr. Ortiz.
I see this as being something that could be very effective and transformational in passing future legislation around accessible affordable housing. That being said, I'm going to go back to the economic environment, financial environment that we have here in Colorado when it comes to funding projects like this. So, I think that I would recommend or ask the committee to consider adding something of a ledge deck of sorts. Because what I am afraid of is that this will be used as an obstacle from us making moves on what is obviously already a shortage of accessible housing options. So what do I mean by that? This is based off my lived experience as a legislator. When I would try and bring forward legislation mandating a certain percentage of units becoming accessible, and they'd be like, well, what data exists out there really? Well, first of all, we know nationally that there's enough data to say that less than 1% of accessible units are accessible for people with the most severe, mobility disabilities, and less than 5% are accessible at all. And we know nationally that there are 20% to 25% of Americans that live with any type of disability. So it is quite obvious that there is a shortage. So this pushback on, do we really need that type of a stock, and would it be really utilized? That's what I want to prevent here by putting in ledge deck. So I would recommend that we put in some type of preamble that states the executive committee acknowledges that there is an obvious deficiency in accessible housing options, list the data that I just stated, and state that gathering specific data should not be used as an obstacle for alleviating a very obvious deficiency in accessible housing options. So that's going to be my ask for this committee to consider and kind of get their feedback or their thoughts on what I just said.
Thank you, Representative Hillary.
So just to be very transparent about this recommendation, I am very conflicted. And not because I wouldn't love to have data. I would absolutely love to have data. I think data is needed. However, as anyone who has ever collected data of this kind knows, it takes a tremendous amount of resources to not only collect the data on the front end, but then to maintain the data so it's current every year. And I just am so conflicted about whether or not, given everything, this is like the best use of resources. I don't even know functionally if we can create a complete data set around housing, around accessible housing, because it's not the same as asking property owners how many bedrooms do your units have, right? They might literally have to measure the doors in every unit. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have, I just really struggle with whether or not we are actually going to get data compliance and how good the data is going to be. And even I think in order to get good data, we're going to have to do a bunch of education around what accessible means. And maybe that is efforts well spent. Maybe educating property owners on what accessibility truly means has a multiplier effect. I just am really, really struggling with this recommendation because in a perfect world where we could collect the data that it was logistically possible, I would be a very enthusiastic yes. I just having done a lot of data collection in my career, I just don't know that we are going to get the data we want and then it's going to be complete. So I will stop talking right now. Oh, and it would cost a lot of money to get that data.
Understood. And I'm going to bring Elizabeth in next. I think this is, I'm not going to cut this conversation short by any means. I think this is a good opportunity to have a rich conversation. This is likely one we're going to need to workshop and come back to. I will only say that, Hillary, what you're highlighting was the very frustration of the subcommittee, that there is this absence of data and it's difficult to get. So how do you map a long-term plan to have the right number of units if you don't have the data? And this circular challenge of data is difficult. We can't act without data. So we may want to be making this part of what comes out of this group and the 1296 legacy of a 5-year or 10-year plan that moves us toward it with a lot of the education you're talking about. My sense is we're going to need to work this one a bit and come back to it to even consider voting on it. But let's continue the conversation. Elizabeth?
So I agree with everything that's been said. And for me personally, from my lens, one of the things we talk about when we talk about taking steps and systems change and understanding the hurdles that would be the challenges we would need to overcome to collect the data, one of the things we talk about a lot is that data drives almost everything. And if we can't provide the data that shows the lack of accessible, affordable housing and shows not just that there's a lack of, but in what areas specifically, and again, understanding all the caveats with lack of funding and you know, it basically self-reporting in a way, right? So you know, we're relying on, but I guess my hesitance to bump this at all is that I feel like this is actually where we should be starting. Like this is where we should be investing our time and money, is on the data collection. And although it might be imperfect, trusting that our engagement in collecting that data will also inform where we need to collect, what kinds of data, what kind of methods we need to use. If nothing else, just to get started, right? Rather than, yeah. So, and I very much like your recommendation, Barrick, that we look at this as a long-term plan, right? Understanding the fiscal challenges we are in right now. It could be a while before we're able to do this, but if we could start planting those seeds now, I think that would be a good thing.
And maybe, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to bring Rep. Ortiz in. Rep. Ortiz, I'm curious, you know, if we can't build on your suggestion of a preamble or a ledge deck that keeps this in its entirety, but acknowledges that this is not a simple, minimal cost or 1-year project, but that the executive committee believes this is critical to the long-term work and that steps should begin immediately, even if not everything can be acted on. And this was, obviously my language is imperfect, which is why I'm saying we're gonna have to come back to this at some point. Rep. Ortiz, your thoughts?
Yeah, so first I want to clarify, to me, it sounds like Hillary Jorgensen and Elizabeth Moran are saying opposite things. Like, and I don't think that we should wait on the work for this data as a starting point. I don't think this is a starting point. I think we have enough data to know that there is an obvious shortfall in accessible housing. Acknowledging that enough of that data exists out there that we need to do the work is like, we need to acknowledge that there's enough data to say that we already know enough to say that this is an issue and that we need to be working on this. So just to clarify, like, I feel like Hillary and Elizabeth are saying opposite things. In addition to the ledge deck that I recommended earlier, I also would, oh my gosh, I lost it now that I just said that. I also want to make sure that we include another part that I am spacing on, and I'm so upset that I'm spacing on it right now. That not only do we know that this is an issue, but that to incorporate some of what Hillary said, that this would take an immense amount of time, effort, and resources, and that the executive committee believes that there are better uses for that time, energy, and resources. Like, I would be willing to add, because I believe so much in what Hillary has just said, that I would be wanting to add that into the ledge deck. And again, I'm not saying that data is not important. Do not get me wrong. I am just saying that, one, there's enough data to know that this is an issue. And two, we should not let data analysis of the nitty-gritty details paralyze us, unintended, from moving forward with the work. So, and I'm afraid that, I know I've worked with Elizabeth. I know she's well-intentioned. I know she's effective at the work she does. Not all entities out there are, and I know that they will use this as an obstacle, as an excuse for not doing the work. So.
Understood. And if you see me looking away, it's because I have 3 screens where I'm capturing a ton of notes here about the idea that the executive committee acknowledges that even with the shortage of data, we know there is a shortage of affordable, accessible housing, and that we should take action with or without the funding for or the collection and analysis of this additional data, and that the exec committee recognizes this would be a significant investment, that there may be other investments that would yield a greater return on investment toward creating more affordable, accessible housing.
If I may
Avoiding
get
the
pushed back on
highly
the shortage of data part, I don't want to even use that.
Okay.
I will say, if there is not there might not exist enough specific siloed data, maybe specific data to Colorado. I want to say there's not enough to the nth degree data out there, but there is enough data to show that there's clearly a shortage of accessible housing. And if we want to cite as an executive committee a real world anecdotal example, we can cite the nonprofit that kicked out a bunch of SCI individuals from their apartment complexes up in Longmont to make room for those with brain injuries like that. So I want to make it clear that there is enough data to show that this is an obvious shortage. There might not exist specific data, but we don't need that specific data to understand that we have to create more accessible housing, and also acknowledge that there might be a better use of time and resources to solving the problem versus trying to flesh out specific information on the problem.
Understood. And what I'm going to do is spend time over the next week trying to craft language around all this. I will probably reach out to each of you individually for your feedback on it. But we're obviously not voting on this one today because we need to add some more language. But before I move us on, let me bring in Hillary and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, so in hearing this conversation, I think I just want to be really specific in naming my concerns around this recommendation. The first is, Elizabeth, I totally get your point that collecting this kind of data takes time. The problem is we're not stopping building housing. So even if we give it a 10-year runway, you have new housing stock added every year. And so it's not just building the data set from a fixed point. It's like building the data set and then you have to maintain it. And I think that's one of my very specific concerns. And then my second very specific concern is that I believe that will happen, just based on experience with some other data I have collected, is we are most likely to get data around the newest construction because that information will be most readily available to property owners. You can start an apartment building in the last 5 years. You probably are really familiar with, the measurements of your building and stuff. And we will get less data around stuff that is less recently constructed. And you might end up having a skewed data set, right? And so I guess those are my 2 really specific, nitty-gritty in the weeds concerns about giving a really long runway, and also the fact that not only is data hard to collect, but we may end up with a skewed data set because of who I believe is likely to respond with data.
Thank you, Hillary. I've received 2 requests in the chat. A reminder that I promised people a break when I was running you for 2 hours. I've had 2 people now say, Barrick, I need that break. It's 12:35. I'm going to ask everybody to be back at the conversation within 5 minutes to continue this. Elizabeth, can you hold your thought until then? Perfect. And everybody, I apologize for holding you for an extra 30. If you're hiding off camera, we're going to come back into the discussion in 1 minute. It is 12:40. I know I was late in giving you the break, but if you're able to, I would love to get you back on camera so we can continue the conversation. Thank you all, and particularly those who nudged me, reminding me that I promised a 5-minute break if we were going more than 90 minutes. You didn't know I would make you wait 95 minutes for that. I will be better going forward. I think we've got most of our members back. Miss Moran, are you back with us? You had your hand up and I asked you to hold your thought until we were back together.
If I may, Barry, to give her some time, unless she's
Absolutely.
here.
Yeah.
I just want to, on a personal note, and you and Carrie have been great working with me on this, but I think the executive committee needs to know like why I'm off camera and what's going on is that I've been dealing with surgery on my wrist. And so if you can imagine a paraplegic that all of a sudden only has one arm, that's kind of a big issue. So getting great care here at the VA, but just wanted to give that context. And I really want to thank you and Carrie for being flexible and working with me while all this is happening.
No, we appreciate you and know that's a whole new layer of frustration. I'm glad here the VA is giving you good treatment. Miss Moran, are you back with us? I don't think she is. We clearly, and Elizabeth, when you get back, I'm going to follow up with her. We have a lot to adjust on this. Hillary, Elizabeth, to you with your
Sir.
thought.
Ugh. You know what? I just wanted to say out loud. I certainly appreciate Representative Ortiz. Talking about we've worked together and we respect each other, and I feel the same way. I just think we're approaching it a little bit differently, and I absolutely respect everything that's been said, and that's why when I started out earlier, I said yes, what they said, and so not but and there's this other. I think it's good that we're tabling this one to give us all a chance to just chew on it a little bit more and see kind of where we want to spend our time and propose that money is spent. So thank you.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm going to try not to harass folks too much over the holidays. This is not an and, this is a but. But I am going to send you some language individually to look at as we try to capture this language that with or without whatever data exists, we know there's a shortage. We also have to think about where dollars are most effectively spent. We all believe better data is better, but we don't think better data should hold us up from doing good work and getting more units online. That's my very vacation mode mind on that language. I'll get it a lot more professional when I circulate it to you. So we will workshop that. I'm going to move us to a couple more recommendations. We'll see what we get through. We're going to spend some more time in the new year talking housing as well as our government and COTA rewrite. But the next idea, recommendation 7, is similar to the one we talked about navigation supports for developers and property owners. This is about providing educational materials for developers about accessibility needs. And the sense of the group was that there are limited resources available to developers about accessibility needs, features, or best practices. And the group wants to create a world where developers have access to and are aware of information relating to accessibility needs and best practices that then become part of the developer's processes and recommendations. The group's recommendation is to direct an appropriate state agency to develop or to contract to have developed and make available educational materials targeting developers about accessibility needs, features, and best practices. They do note that efficiency and effectiveness and reach of materials should be a consideration. So that should include examining opportunities to integrate these with other publications or tools, such as the Developer's Guide or others that are available through CHAPA and DOLA. DOLA provided the following comment that the Division of Housing and Local Government provide a variety of information and guidance to local governments and housing developers. Creating and maintaining additional guidance on developing accessible housing would require additional resources. A non-state organization with experience developing accessible properties might be better equipped to address this need. So the fundamental idea, though, is to develop educational materials for developers to better understand the needs out there. It seems that there are some differing opinions. The subcommittee suggested DOLA or CHAFA. DOLA or CHAFA has said, or DOLA has said, maybe not us, maybe it's a third party. So let me open it up to conversation. Let me ask a question. Yes, Hillary, jump in.
I was gonna say, I like this one. I like that, you know, the subcommittee made a recommendation around integrating with existing publications, etc. I do think this is an appropriate word for government, and if they feel like they don't have the in-house expertise, they can always contract it out.
And that is what the subcommittee explicitly said, was to direct them to develop or contract to have developed. Any other thoughts, favors, concerns, thoughts? Elizabeth, and then Rep. Ortiz.
I am in support of this, and I have questions about developing accessible additional guidance. I have to assume that all of our agencies have something built in so that they can, as we learn to do things better, we do them better, and we do updates, and we do as part of just our regular practice. I don't see this as a cost prohibitive ask, particularly that we're 35 years post ADA. I hope they have materials already that we could just be updating. And if not, I hope to Hillary's point that they would consult with those who have expertise outside, just as they would hire any other consultant to come in on any project they're doing. And I'll leave it at that.
And Elizabeth, just to that point, we mentioned this at the start of exec committee deliberations a few weeks ago. These recommendations really fall into the categories of enforce what should be happening, educate people about what they should be doing, and help people navigate where we can do better. And this was one of those ones that the group themselves described as the low-hanging fruit, to just educate some people on what needs to happen. Rep. Ortiz.
Yeah, I'd also don't know if it'd be appropriate to say should also consider, or maybe make a separate recommendation, but just as was discussed around maybe creating a disabled chamber of commerce that also has someone on staff that can advise or work with other members of chambers of commerces on how to become more accessible, not just for the clients they serve, but for the staff that they might hire. Maybe encourage these professional associations with developers and architectures or whatever to also consider bringing someone on board that can be a resource for themselves. And I don't know, like I would welcome feedback from my fellow committee members on whether they think we should integrate it in this, and say maybe this should also be considered, or maybe it's its own recommendation, and then what the value is in it.
Members, thoughts on, and I think there were a couple of ideas in that. One is the idea of establishing a disability chamber of commerce. Rep. Ortiz has talked before.
Nope, that was cited as just an example. So like the recommendation is that within professional organizations, within developers, like among architectures, or that those national professional organizations consider bringing on consultants that would act as a resource for their individual members.
Thank you for correcting me. Hillary.
I really like that suggestion, and I think it gets back to a comment I made my first meeting. This was only my second meeting. My first meeting there, I was asking / commenting that, obviously this report is to the legislature, which would indicate that, the recommendation for legislative action, but I am not opposed if we think there are recommendations like the suggestion that Ortiz just made. I'm not opposed to including some recommendations aimed at the private sector in this report, and I think and then what excuse me is a good one. Because I think government, there's a lot government can do. There should also be some responsibility in the private sector too.
Amen.
Appreciate that. And I have been short in my reminders that were probably a little more dominant 6 months ago. That recommendations that you all consider should span that entire continuum, from the state requiring something to best practices we think state and local government should do, or those things that we think the private sector or nonprofit communities should do. So, Rep. Ortiz and Hillary, I appreciate you bringing us to that. I'm going to ask the group if this idea around within professional organizations recommending that they consider bringing on experts and national resources to provide expertise on this, should we look at that as a separate idea from this earlier one, which is about directing a state agency to develop the educational materials for developers? And I'm only offering as your facilitator, they both seem important. They seem somewhat distinct.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was assuming that they would actually be two separate recommendations. One aimed at the state and one aimed at private industry.
And I support that. I support that.
Okay, so what I will do then, with everybody's permission, is recommendation 7 will be as is, to direct an appropriate state agency to develop or contract to have developed and make available these educational materials. We will then go to a new recommendation. I'm going to call it 7B for right now, that we recommend that within professional organizations, they consider bringing on these experts. But let's vote on them separately. Item 7, the recommendation from your subcommittee to direct the agency to create or develop to be created. Mr. Ortiz.
Yes.
Ms. Moran.
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen.
Yes.
Ms. Harpole.
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
By unanimous vote, recommendation 7 to create these educational resources will move forward. We will now go forward with a roll call vote for item 7B, which is recommending that professional organizations consider bringing on experts and those with lived experience to provide insights on disability and accessibility issues and needs. And we will go straight to the roll call vote on that. Mr. Ortiz.
Yes.
Ms. Moran.
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen.
Yes.
Ms. Harpole.
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
By unanimous vote, our new idea, recommendation 7B, will move forward. We are at 12:53. I'm going to read an idea and look to you to see if this is a slam dunk and we go to a vote, or we have a few minutes of discussion and we come back to it on our next call. We are moving into the financing and permitting and oversight. This one relates to CHAFA. And this is to encourage CHAFA to apply all available levers. The group noted that there are few financing or funding vehicles or tools at the state's disposal to drive the development of affordable, accessible housing. The Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, or CHAFA, may not currently be maximizing every opportunity to encourage the expansion of this inventory or development. The goal is to have CHAFA engage individuals with a disability in their deliberation and take action to utilize available levers to encourage the development of more accessible units. Before I read the recommendation, I think it's important to note the group discussed first directing CHAFA to do certain things, and on some stakeholder feedback acknowledged that the state may not have the legal standing to direct CHAFA. So the recommendation is as follows. Encourage the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority to apply all possible levers of action to expand the inventory of affordable, accessible housing, including modifications to the Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP, to provide targeted incentives for developing accessible units. Ask CHAFA to invite a member of the disability community to serve on their tax credit advisory and QAP working groups. Additionally, ask CHAFA to explore all opportunities for financing of construction or modification of accessible single-family homes. By a quick show of hands, should we take this to a vote, or would folks like that? I'm seeing some thumbs. Is there anybody who wants to have discussion before I go to a vote?
Ready for a vote?
Ready for a vote? Mr. Ortiz,
Yes.
Ms. Moran,
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen,
Yes.
Ms. Harple,
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. We're going to see if my luck is going to stay with me, and we'll move from CHAPA to MIHA, the Middle Income Housing Authority. This one is to encourage MIHA to apply all available levers. And again, the group found that there are few financing or funding vehicles or tools at the state's disposal to drive the development of affordable, accessible housing. The Middle Income Housing and Finance Authority may not currently be maximizing every opportunity, and they want to create a state where MIHA leverages any available levers to encourage the development of more accessible units. I'll read the recommendation. There is no pressure on whether we're voting on this or not. We're obviously going to see each other again in the new year. But their recommendation is to encourage the Middle Income Housing Authority to leverage any authorities it has, including elements of bonds issued, to prioritize the development of additional accessible housing. Is there anyone who would like to have discussion prior to going to a vote? Then I will move us to a vote. Mr. Ortiz,
Yes.
Ms. Moran,
Yes.
Ms. Jorgensen,
Yes.
Ms. Harple,
Yes.
Mr. Stone.
Yes.
By unanimous vote, that one will move forward. We do have 4 remaining items. There's no way I'm trying to get through 4 items in 3 minutes, nor am I going to ask you the week before the holidays to stay late. What I will be doing is following up with all of you on that meaty data conversation we had, how to approach that. When we come back together, we will talk about some of these other ideas around leveraging available funds, around encouraging disability forward design, creating a strategy and work plan for centralized resources, and using a legislative deck to encourage local action. All that to say, you have time to think about that. I want to thank our interpreters today. I know we recruited you a little bit in the final hour, and I'm grateful not only for you joining us, but for you going with me speaking 60 miles an hour to get us through this. We thank you for making sure that our meetings are as accessible as possible. Members, in a week leading up to the holiday, I can't thank you enough for your continued investment of time in this. Our next time we'll be together will be January 6th from 3 to 5 p.m. We'll then be digging into the government subcommittee's ideas. As you're noticing, we're having a little bit of carry forward, 2 or 3 ideas from outdoor rec, a couple of ideas here, all to say we're going to spend some bonus time together because government has a lot of ideas, and I'm under no delusion that the CADA rewrite is going to be a simple conversation. We're going to need to dig into that. That will also be that week. All this to say, you get a break from me for a couple weeks other than pestering you by email for some input. I do hope, whether you're celebrating a holiday or not, that the next 10 days involve some time away from computers, some time away from work, most importantly, some time to do what refills your cup. I'm grateful for the opportunity we have had this past year with you. I'm particularly grateful for today's conversation and how collaboratively everybody has moved these ideas forward. We'll follow up by email on some of the language. I'm going to try not to bother you at all next week. I'll see you in 2025 when we're going to keep moving this needle forward. Before I let us go, though, I want to go first to Mr. Ortiz and then to Lieutenant Governor for any final words.
Thanks. Just want to all thanks to Barrick and Kerry for their amazing work with the subcommittees and now with us. We really appreciate you. Wouldn't be as effective without you. So thank you to the interpreters. Thank you. And to the LTG, we appreciate your leadership and all the work you've done here. If you guys haven't seen it, there is a report out there that talks about disability rights and basic access around the world, but also in the US specifically. And just want to point out that in that report, it states that Colorado is currently #1. And I want you to know that it has a lot to do with the advocates that have been doing this work for longer since I've been disabled, for the leadership of allies that are completely able-bodied that still support, the work that we need to be done in our rights and our basic access. It's because of all of you guys. That's something to be celebrated. Let's not rest on our laurels, and let's keep working hard to make sure we get this executive committee voting on the things we do to push forward the work. So thank you all so much. Happy holidays. Enjoy your time.
Lieutenant Governor.
Well, Rep. Ortiz, get well soon. And yes, you stole my thunder. We are rated the best state for people with disabilities, and that's a lot due to Josh Winkler also and the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition and all the advocates. Josh and I were just talking this morning that we're not ranked #1 in every category, so we got some work to do, and we'll continue to work on that. But it's pretty exciting. But our work isn't done. But happy holidays, everybody. Thanks, Barrick. You've done a great job.
Thank you all. We'll see you in 2025.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Bye, thank you.